Hello, Douglas. If I can say Douglas, by the way.
Perfect.
Okay, good. All right. Good to have you here. I know where you are, but people do not know where you are. They might not even know what France24 is, so we'll get to that in a moment. Tell us a little bit about yourself, if you want. Where do you come from originally? Where are you now? And a little bit of your cultural frame of reference, which for me is something more than 2 weeks holiday in Cancun, for instance.
Absolutely.
Right? So focus a little bit on that, please.
I'm a little bit, I suppose, Chris, I don't know, a professional and a cultural chameleon, and I often have trouble sort of figuring out myself where I identify. I'm a native-born New Yorker. Your viewers, your listeners might be able to tell a little bit from my accent. It's never gone away. Once in New York, always in New York. Slightly. Okay, maybe it's been flattened out over the years. But I've really been living out of the U.S. and of New York City since the late 90s, since January 1999. That's when I made a big leap across the pond in wearing my journalistic cap, because I started my career as a journalist, and I like to consider myself a journalist, although that definition is very wide-ranging and broad. I went to work in London after previous stints working in Russia. I was a Russian specialist early in my career, never went to journalism school. I actually did Russian and post-Soviet studies and language and literature, so I came in sort of through that backtrack. As I tell my journalism students often, I never went to journalism school. Yes, it can help you, but it's not really necessary. There are many other roads. There are many other roads into journalism. The prime one, I guess, being just curiosity, asking a lot of questions, wanting to know things constantly to the point of being irritating and annoying sometimes. But I leaped across the pond. I went to CNN International in London, which at the time was a hub for the business production. I did a lot of business shows. I stayed there for a little over 5 years, and to cut to the chase, since 2004, I have been here where I am right now speaking to you today in France, basically based in the same general area in eastern Paris around République, the square where they're known for all the big demonstrations all the time near the Canal Saint-Martin. So a very vibrant sort of, if you want to see how Paris is changing and France is changing, this is a very good vantage to get a sort of bird's eye view of all of those changes away from sort of traditional Western Paris. So I've been here since 2004. 2 years after I arrived here, you're still following me. I'll get through this resume line.
It's fine. Go on.
It's 2 years after that. I gave up my job at CNN. Basically, took a little bit of a leap to do what I thought was going to be a sort of Franco-American cultural project, maybe a radio show with a colleague who was also a fellow Francophile, also a journalist. That never really got off the ground. I ended up doing translation work a while. I ended up doing a little bit of teaching. And then, lo and behold, Jacques Chirac was president at the time. He had wanted to launch a news channel that would be the sort of Francophone, Francophile retort to the likes of BBC and CNN. And it was to be called France24. I was a little skeptical it was actually going to happen, but I was literally sitting in a cafe, proverbially trying to write the great American novel in Paris. That didn't happen. When all of a sudden, I heard this thing was launching. Next thing I know is I got off the ground with France24 at its inception in 2006. 18 years later, I've been there ever since, just celebrated my 18th anniversary there. Hard to believe. Yeah, how fast time flies. I've evolved at France24, but it's an interesting channel because it's called France24, and the idea being, like I said, it was meant to be a Francophone retort to CNN, meaning there was a perception that CNN, even the BBC, had what the French like to refer to as an Anglo-Saxon agenda in their reporting of the news, an Anglo-Saxon outlook on the world, with sort of a focus on the areas of the world that they feel closest to, both linguistically or culturally or imperialistically. With France, our focus at France24, what's really, I think, made us different. We don't have the resources of a CNN, we're smaller. We don't have the resources of a BBC, but where we've been able to, I believe successfully, carve out a niche internationally is in covering areas of the world that we see as being undercovered in a lot of the other traditional international news channels and media. So what I mean by that is the Middle East and Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, also Northern Africa, the so-called Maghreb region, we're very, very hard focused on. And cover those really in our news reports regularly, covering stories out of places that don't get much coverage often on the CNNs or the BBCs, or even, Al Jazeera is perhaps a little closer to us in its outlook, geographically and conceptually. But we do, I think, have enough of our own sort of template that we've been able to, like I said, successfully set ourselves apart from CNN, because I think we're cognizant of the fact we can't compete with them, say, on American news in the American market. We're not going to compete with BBC on British news in the British market, or even the Northern European market. It's difficult. But I think that generally our viewership is scattershot. It's all across the map. I often get, a lot of feedback on my Twitter feed and emails and whatnot from people all over the world. Literally, we have a very large listenership in India, which, as you know, has the largest English-speaking population in the world. First English-speaking country. I guess a lot of people don't really think of that right off the tip of their tongue. A lot of people in Nigeria. Nigeria, think of this, over 200 million population in Nigeria. But we have tons of listeners there because a lot of them do have a common language. They also speak English. So in a lot of Anglophone African countries, the channel I broadcast on, which is mostly, not exclusively, but mostly the English language channel of France24, we get a lot of listeners in those areas. Across Southeast Asia, also in Northern Europe, we have a lot of people in Norway, a lot of listeners in Sweden, a lot of people in Ireland. So like I said, it's really scattershot, and I never cease to be amazed at the diversity of where our viewers are coming from. As a journalist at CNN, when I was in London, we were always, our big conundrum, our big dilemma was always, who is our listenership? Who's our viewership? Whom are we talking to when we go on air? And we used to be told, imagine yourself as this sort of amorphous journalistic blob floating somewhere over Austria, sort of Central Europe, and you're sort of talking to all of them diffusely. And I couldn't quite get a handle on that. And sometimes at France24, I have to be honest, it's even harder. Like I said, I'm a foreign affairs commentator. I'm supposed to sort of be the person who crunches the news of the day for people, not really giving the factual. I weigh in a little bit with my point of view, an informed point of view, but I'm supposed to sort of give them a context and make people sit up and say, why do I care about this story? Why should I be listening to it? Why shouldn't I zap channels right now and start watching BBC or CNN? So I approach it that way. And rather than thinking of whom am I talking to, where are they? I think of sort of a family member. I think, what would I say on the phone right now if I was speaking to my grandmother, my older grandmother, and then she was saying, what's happening right now in Russia and Ukraine? And I had to sort of gather my thoughts and not dumb it down. She's a very smart person, she died, but and think, how would I explain this to her in a way that will make it compelling for her, interesting, anecdotal, and bring home the sense that this does actually make a difference in her life, even if it seems like some far away, far-flung, remote conflict. Right. So that's my job. And at France24, I've given up trying to identify whom I'm supposed to be talking to. Am I talking to someone sitting in there, in somewhere in central Djibouti? Am I talking to someone in Goa, India? Am I speaking to someone out on the outskirts of Oslo in Norway? Am I speaking to someone on the west coast of California? We have a lot of listeners in California. So, like I said, I give up and I try to boil it down to a sort of, if I can, in a news sense, a lowest cultural common denominator. Universal truths that I think will draw people into a story regardless of where they're listening. And of course, Chris, I'd be lying not to tell you, of course we do stories which are more sometimes targeted to one region than another, in which case I do assume perhaps more people in a certain region will be listening to this analysis, this story. And I'll perhaps have a certain level of assumption that some viewers know certain basic facts about the story, but I still try to bring the fundamentals in. I still try not to assume too much. And this is where the cultural, I guess, guesswork comes in. What is a lowest cultural denominator in journalism? How do you give across cultures what we might call a nut graph? In American journalism, we call it a nut graph, which is supposed to be that succinct 1 or 2 line paragraph where you say, oh, by the way, this is why you're reading this story. This is what this story is about. And that's essentially what my job has boiled down to for the past, 18 or so years at France24. I travel a lot, not as much as I used to, perhaps. Pandemic put a hold on a lot of the travel. We're just getting back up to speed. But, I cover a lot of G7, G20 summits, a lot of that big summitry, big international meeting stuff. Right. But in the past, I've also done stuff. I've been to, Eastern Ukraine, not in this time around. In the last time, 2014, I went on several assignments over to both Donbass. I was in Crimea shortly before the annexation, days before the annexation there. So I try to cover a lot of bases. I covered recently, when Biden was inaugurated, I go to the U.S. for a lot of the U.S. political coverage. We're looking ahead to the midterms there. So I have
So it's not only Russian or Russia.
No,
or
no.
the Russian-speaking, the ex-Soviet Union, if you want.
Chris, to be honest, I don't have the luxury of being able to only concentrate as a commentator at an international channel like France24. I can't just concentrate on Russia and the former Soviet republics and Ukraine. I can't do it. Obviously, the headlines lately have been dominating out of that region, and I have been doing a lot. Yeah, obviously, I've been doing a lot on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. But, I constantly find myself circling back to the European home front, even putting on my former business cap. I used to be a business financial reporter for several years. So obviously now gas, energy markets, all of that, constantly put back my business cap, all of that on. And when I speak about the US as well, zeroing it back in on U.S. markets. What's going on right now with the jobs market there, with inflation there? How is Biden being perceived with energy prices? Gas prices were coming down. Now they're going back up. How's that politically going to impact the midterms? So there's a lot of variables constantly circling around in my mind, which I'm trying to factor into my coverage. But I do not have exclusive domain on Russia, Ukraine. Yes, I trained as a Russia specialist way back when in the 90s and late 80s. However, I started out earlier in the US in high school studying French. And my first cultural experience had nothing to do with Russia. It was 2 summers of a home exchange experience in Southwest France, in the French wine country, around an area called the Lot-et-Garonne region. So I started out really as a Francophile.
Where did that interest come from? I mean, being an American, and I would call it an enlightened American who has actually stepped out of the country and has seen different areas. And from your LinkedIn profile, I saw that you have 3 passports, or at least three language: a American passport of identity by birth, a British, and a French passport.
My dirty secret.
I'm not going to ask how you got those. That's not the point. The point is more, how do you get that interest, and do you speak all these languages then? I mean, and do you speak Russian in this case?
I speak Russian. Yeah, I studied Russian early on, and I've kept it up ever since. I might not be as sharp as the days when I was actually living and reporting in Moscow in the mid 90s and early 90s, but I still have a very good working knowledge of Russian, written and spoken. And French, obviously, I live here, so yes, I have near native fluency now in French. But my interest, it's funny because in the U.S. it was a joke when I was growing up. I grew up in New York City. I grew up on the Upper East Side of New York City. And I was very lucky. I was fortunate as a child. I had a lot of opportunities presented to me, both culturally and travel-wise. My family were travel fiends. As a young kid, even I have pictures of myself in London before I even had memories of it, standing by the Beefeater guards. A little annoying that you can't remember any of that. But so from an early age, I think I picked up the travel bug from my parents. They used to host students from the United Nations, which is obviously based in New York. We'd have them regularly over to dinner. I was exposed to people from a lot of different countries. So I was always, I guess, from an early age, very attuned to the fact that even though New Yorkers love to think of themselves a little pretentiously as being the center of the universe, I was very much aware of the fact that no, we are not. We are not the center of the universe. There is a giant universe and galaxy out there, and a lot of worlds. And I saw that when I traveled. And I said I wanted to do this myself, and back in the when I was a kid growing up, late 70s, 80s, it was, you had a choice of 2 languages in school, Spanish or French. We didn't even go into the exotic languages, I say in quote, like German, let alone Russian. Forget Russian. Forget Dutch. Dutch. Off the charts, but Spanish or French. I ended up taking French, and I was bitten by the French bug. And like I said, because I was fortunate, because I had opportunity, I got to do this early exchange program in the southwest of France. I was plunged into a living experience in a family in the wine region between Toulouse and Bordeaux, a family that spoke 0 English. Basically plucked down there in the middle of, the vineyards and the sunflower fields and the chateau, and forced to learn French, a crash course. literally immersion. And I absolutely loved it. I saw the world differently coming back. I know that sounds cliched
No, I understand very
sort of
much.
proverbial.
Yeah.
Another person who's had his early cultural exchange homestay experience and came back and his life was transformed. But it's a cliche for a reason. It really does change your perspectives in your life, especially for someone like myself. You could tend to, you grew up in a big city. You're already exposed to so many cultural opportunities and theater and arts and culinary and all of that. And it's true. But this was very different on a different scale. And I think experiencing that, I came back knowing that I needed to keep doing that. I needed to sort of slake. I had a new thirst. I had to slake my thirst for these experiences. I went back to France. I started intensifying my study of French. And I even went to university originally with a French minor. I wanted to really continue studying French intensively with perhaps the goal of trying to find something journalistically in Paris. I ended up going in, like I said, to the back door, not through Russian, through French. I did a travel guide. I did a travel guide that had been published by where I had been a grad student at Harvard Graduate Schools. I was studying Russian, but I did a travel guide in France in the early 90s. Let's Go France. It was a budget student travel guide where I covered 50 towns and villages. And
I know the Let's Go series. Yes, I used that,
that
when I was in the States. Yeah,
it's crazy, right? Everything's a blur. Everything's a blur. You're sitting up till 3 a.m. writing your copy. Back then, I didn't have my laptop computer, sending it into to Harvard Yard for editing every night. But it taught me, it was an early experience, and it was sort of a pseudo journalistic experience in that I had to meet deadlines. I had to write every night. I had to spend the entire day doing so-called reporting, which in the case of a travel guide is researching, visiting museums, restaurants, asking people, how's the food, how's that steak, how's the entrecôte, all of that, and coming back and writing it up and making it interesting for readers. So it was an early journalistic experience, and one thing led to another, and the linguistic thing just came along with it, Chris, because at university I started intensively studying Russian. But that led me in my junior year, which in the U.S. is your third year of university. I went to study in Moscow. I was one of the first groups, really, American groups to study at a big then Soviet institute. It was called the Moscow Energy Institute. We were like zoo animals. We may as well have been in cages because we all had our own little dormitory. We were all confined together, 25 of us in a Soviet university of 25,000 students, many of whom had never met an American before. They came like curiously wanting to meet us and look at us and see what we were like, and it was fascinating from both perspectives, me being able to see them and breaking down, shattering the walls of the cliches about, Russian and Soviet students, and them seeing that, hey, we were normal people just like them. And so all of that. And I think that the combination of those early sort of cultural exchanges, the linguistic experiences, I came out of grad school, I'm saying, well, what do I do with this? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a doctor. I don't have special engineering training. I'm not a mathematician or a scientist. So you do what everyone who has no skills does, right? You go into journalism, but except they are skills. It's just not scientifically identified as such. And that's why I guess we have journalism schools, because journalists need a way to sort of explain to themselves that we are a science in a way. We can study the so-called rules of journalism. But the fact of the matter is, at least in my case, I find that if you have that basic curiosity and the determination, you can teach yourself a lot of those tricks of journalism. You just have to. The trick with journalism is you have to just do it, and you do it, and before you know it. And I know that sounds like, what does he mean, just do it? Easier said than done. But I mean, I guess I did learn on the fly. A lot of my early copy, a lot of the stuff I did early on when I look back on it in Russia, even here in France, it's a little embarrassing. I mean, I was a real rookie. I was completely green, and I was, myself, the way I wrote, the way I structured, the way I did my reporting. It wasn't really what I would call the quality that I would like to put into reporting today, but you learn it on the fly, and you hone it.
You see yourself back again, and you learn from that as well. Now, here's a question. There's a saying that says you can take the American out of the United States, but you cannot take the United States out of the America. This pertains to you then. Same goes for me, being a Dutchman, by the way, living in Paris myself at this moment. How do you? Okay, it's a two-tiered question. How do you get your news? And how do you filter out your Anglo-Saxon upbringing, which you cannot really eradicate, I guess?
You cannot. And you know what? To be honest, I don't even try to do it. Coming from this school, even the school in the generic sense of American journalism. There's this conceit, if I can call it that, in American journalism of pure objectivity, that some of the world's, best papers, the New York Times, which I love, I adore the Times. I had worked for it as a freelance writer and researcher in Russia early on, and back in New York on the Metro desk as a freelancer. Great paper. But there is this conceit that you can be truly objective. And I think cultural bias is built into everything, into every report. And if I had sort of identified the major delineator, say, between the UK where I worked and the US as far as journalism is concerned, it's that the UK, a lot of their journalism, they don't have that conceit. Like a paper like The Guardian will call itself a progressive newspaper. They will wear that badge proudly. And they know that they have a progressive bias, so to speak. It doesn't preclude them from being able to report objectively and factually. Whereas I think the New York Times would more shun labels. If someone were to say, "Oh, they're this left-wing paper," I don't think they would appreciate that. So I think there's more of a wearing your cultural bias, wearing your leanings, your political leanings on your sleeve in certain journalistic schools. For me, I don't filter out the US. I'm going to be American, even if I have this pretension of not being American when I give my reports. People are going to listen to me. They're going to hear me speaking. They're going to be saying, "Oh, there's that American guy again." It doesn't matter what I'm saying, how I'm reporting it. You are what you are. And I would disadvise against trying to shed all of that. It's going to be built into you automatically. I would say that the cardinal rules of journalism are just to be fair and balanced and free, and do your homework, do your fact checking. That's the most important thing. When I go back to the US, the irony is, when I go back and visit New York, as I do, a couple of times a year, I'm now seen as being more European, more French. Having gone native a little bit over there, I even find myself using words when I speak to, family and friends back there. I'll say, "Oh, when I was at university." No one in America says university. They say, "When I was at college." But I find myself sometimes in my language using more a Europeanized English than I would if I were back in New York.
Sure.
And conversely, when I'm over here, I'm often still seen as, as American or a New Yorker in Paris, even though, as you said, I have French nationality, I speak fluent French. I think, almost no matter how long you've been here, those biases are going to be with me. I think I'm a little bit of everything, and I'm never completely going to be culturally, I don't know what even culturally pure means, wherever I go back. Right now, I think I've become sort of a little bit of that chameleon. And when I'm in Russian, obviously, I've never, lived long enough in Russia to ever go native with Russian. But in Russia, I do also find myself picking up a lot of the ways of thinking and the ways of doing things when I'm over there. That would be sort of more attuned to that culture. So that's what I mean by the cultural chameleon. I shed sort of certain parts of my cultural skin when I'm in certain places, and I'm sure this will be something familiar to a lot of your listeners who are used to either traveling a lot for business or having studied or worked in a lot of different places. You do become a slightly different person, and you even have, I'd go so far as to say, different friend and professional groups of people that your personality is almost slightly different with. The French Doug is maybe a little, it's not being false or phony. It's that the French Doug might be a slightly different Doug. The Douglas Herbert is a little different than back in New York, Douglas Herbert, or in Russia where I'm Douglas, Douglas Herbert, it's like I'm a little different. And your personality does make a little bit of an adjustment. And part of that might even be based in the fact that just by virtue of speaking a different language, a different way of using a language forces a slight tectonic type of shift in the way you communicate, even in the way you think. I perhaps even think on a certain level differently when I'm speaking French than I would think when I'm speaking English.
Yeah.
Not giant. But
no, I understand. It's the same thing that, and the research also has indicated, and this is the example they used, if you say "I love you" in your native language, it brings up a lot more emotion than if you use a foreign language, English being yours, French being not your native, even though you might speak it fluently. It's like that, and we do adapt. At least if I look at myself, I lived 15 years in Belgium, and now I'm in Paris as a Dutchman. And sometimes I find it very handy to be Dutch, to be as direct as the Dutch are known for. Yes. And oftentimes I go back to the Netherlands because I've got some family there. And I'm surprised by their rudeness, the directness. Oh my goodness. It's good to be back, but it's also good to leave again. You know,
I
if you
understand.
don't mind, Douglas, I'd like to make a bridge with something in terms of what is journalism and talk about
Sure.
fake news for a moment.
I hate
There's
the term. I hate the term.
I know,
Can I
but
just
there are
begin like that? Yeah.
alternative truths. I don't understand that either. What's an alternative truth to graffiti? It is there.
Uh,
So
to
how do
me,
you? So the question here is not so much what is your take on fake news, but
yeah.
how do you avoid that? How do I know, as because I got in touch with you watching you on TV on France 24, um, and then you were kind enough to do this interview. But how do I know when you're giving your informed opinion, you say, about say what's going on right now in Ukraine? And by the way, we're recording this October 11, 2022. For those of you listening in the future, how do I know that what you're telling me, as in your professional situation, is is good, is true, is not an alternative truth or fake news? Huh?
Off the cuff at first blush, you don't. You have
No.
no idea, knowing where I'm coming from, what if I have one, my hidden agenda is what I'm constantly telling. I taught at a Sciences Po journalism school for many years, a fact checking course, and checking the reliability of sources. And I basically said, you don't know. I always started my first class with them. I came into class the first day and I started speaking to them and I said, stop. I said, how do you know I am who I say I am? How do you even know I'm your teacher? I said, and yet I said, well, I don't know. Our teacher for this course is Douglas Herbert. He's from France24. He's teaching a fact checking course. How do you know that's me? How do you know I'm not some imposter walking into the room and
Sure.
starting to teach you anything? I mean, it sounds a little ridiculous. I tried to sort of boil it down to absurdity, but just to get them thinking about, yeah, you have to do these days. You have to do fundamental fact checking about everything. I could be a
Absolutely.
total. Anyone out there can be a total fraud. Look, there are a few basic things in journalism. They always tell you, even before the era of of cyberspace and Twitter and so-called fake news. I hate that term.
Uh-huh.
I like to use maybe information pollution or disinformation
Mhm.
or misinformation, because fake news is too politically charged, in my opinion. But basically, I what you need to do is you need to go back to the very basics. You're only as good as your last story, they used to say.
Mhm.
So in other words, if you've had a spotless, absolutely squeaky clean record for 20 years of your journalism career, but then you screw up badly on one story, that's what everyone's going to remember you for. And that's what you might actually be sacked from your paper, radio, or TV station for. Which is why, journalistic credibility is always, active in real time. My credibility is only as good as my last commentary. So if I go on the set, can I say anything I want? Can I, just start blah, 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 and just mouth off and spew out misinformation? Of course I can.
Mhm.
It would be an abuse, obviously, of all journalistic deontology, as they call it, journalistic ethics.
Mhm.
But beyond that, my viewers and my viewers are very smart. They're often many steps ahead of where I am on the news front. They're all over social media. They'll
Mhm.
call me out very quickly. They'll be all over social media saying that Doug Herbert, who I just watched, he is full of it. I just heard him say A, B, C, and D. Let me tell you the truth. So I have to, both for myself, because I know my viewers are sharp and eagle-eyed,
Yeah.
and listening very closely to everything I'm saying. I have to be true to myself. I have to make sure that I'm as accurate and as rigorous in what I am saying on air as possible. Because if my credibility starts to go, if my credibility is shattered, that's it. It's a slippery slope. You start sliding very quickly down that
Sure.
slope,
Yeah. Mhm.
and it takes a long time. To work your way back up, it's a time in the wilderness to work yourself back up, to gain the credibility again. So the onus is on me, to be as factually correct and rigorous. I am of the school that, like I said, I'm a commentator, which in my opinion means I do give a sort of point of view and analysis on the news of the day, which implicitly there's some of my opinion in there, but I call it, I guess, informed opinion.
Mhm.
Perhaps it sounds a little ludicrous, but the term I like to use is objective opinion. Contradiction in terms, but what I
Sure.
mean by objective opinion is that yes, it's my opinion, but it's an opinion that I'd like to think is based on a lot of research, a lot of cross-checking of sources, not just one source, two or three sources, making sure that before I say, as the French would say, n'importe quoi, just anything on air,
Mhm.
I am pretty damn sure that I have my stats right. So I have to double and triple check. And I've known, because I've made awful mistakes on air in the past. I've made some really bad mistakes. And I think the most important thing is in this age, as you say, of fake news, is if you're called out on something, own it, recognize it, make your correction and your acknowledgement of the error as clear and as visible as possible. Be as transparent as possible, because if we're all fallible, journalists are fallible, even well-meaning, determined, perseverant, diligent journalists, they are well-meaning. Journalists hate making mistakes. It's horrible. It's an awful feeling. It's their career. Be transparent and own it. That's what I do try to do. And I try to, if someone calls me out, I say, absolutely. Thank you very much for pointing that out. I neglected to do this or say this, or sometimes they say you said this out of context, which is also true. It's information which is technically true, but because you don't give it in a proper context or you leave out some other pertinent information, it is essentially very misleading and comes out seeming like fake news. So this is my constant battle. It never gets any easier. There are certain subjects which, time and again, no matter what you say, you're not going to please everyone. I look for that sort of journalistic balance. I hope I get both sides of an issue, or however, all of them sort of chewing me out and telling me that I'm full of it. Because if I have both sides, it means perhaps I'm somewhere right in the middle there. But this is a constant problem. I try to use a diversity of sources. You don't just read your one online paper, and more these days with Telegram. I try to, with Ukraine, Russia, you have to rely on Telegram sources. You have to look at the channels you're using. I'm also very careful. I try to follow sources as a journalist that you don't agree with, that you personally don't agree with.
Yeah.
You know that you have to, I follow all the far right politicians here in France. I do know I don't subscribe to their political agenda, but I want to know what they're saying. I want to be up to date with what they're saying, and I want to get those Twitter updates. So I make sure that I cast a very wide net in who I follow on Twitter, but that I'm also cognizant of the profiles of who I'm following. So when I get a piece of information, whether I'm getting it off of Twitter, whether I'm getting it off of, say, some of the online platforms here, sometimes there are things in France like Brut or Loopsider, which are short videos with little information nuggets. Who took that video? Do they have an agenda? Where were they posting? Are these legitimate people? So I'm always asking constantly, what is the source? What's the source? Where's it coming from? How long has this account existed? Do these people have a hidden agenda? It's very, very important. Very important.
It's something that my youngest daughter, who's now 18, is studying. Well, she's half Indian and half Dutch, but she's studying now in the Netherlands. Grew up in Belgium. Now she's back in the Netherlands, and that's what I tried to teach her from young. When she was young, just think for yourself, because if you don't think for yourself, somebody else will think for you, and hence you will fall into that trap. If I can use this bridge, I have about 3 questions left for you. So making that, since you are, well, I would say an expert, at least you speak the language, you understand, and when I'm talking about Russia, Ukraine, former Soviet Union, I have a personal interest in that because my partner is from the Soviet Union, living in France, is French now, but is born in Russia or the Russian Federation, grew up in Azerbaijan.
Wow. Chris, we call that burying the lead. You buried the lead. That's interesting information.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry about that.
I'm joking.
Anyways, so how do we know, because it's a bridge from fake news to real news? How do we know how to make sense out of this? I mean, I think we know that the Russian people know not much about what's going on. Some do, evidently, but the majority don't. How do we know what's going on, whether that makes sense? How do we get our right, evidently from France24, but what other sources could we use to actually understand what's going on and making sense of this whole mess that's going on?
I try to use a lot of primary sources as well. I mean, yes, you can scroll through the feed of the Kiev Independent, which is, I think, a good paper. They've been doing yeoman's work in this war, reporting from, but clearly, obviously, from a very clear Ukrainian bias. That's not to say, by the way, there's no I hate false equivalency. It's not like on the one side, Ukraine says, on the other side, Russia says. It's not a 50-50 thing in the information sphere right now. There is a lot more. All war has disinformation. Yes, all war has both sides, both
Yes.
militaries trying to put out there, dump their fair share of disinformation, misinformation to try to get military advantage and an information advantage. We know that, information ops, all of that. But I hate false equivalency in the sense of assuming that every side has absolutely equal legitimacy. There is a lot more, and I have to really underline several times, a lot more disinformation coming from the Russian side in this war than from the Ukrainian side. I can say that almost factually. That's not really Doug Herbert giving his opinion. I watch regularly, as often as I can, either clips of or as much as of Russian state news. I watch it to see what they're saying. I want to know if I'm of an older Russian generation sitting down, maybe over 100 million, 80 to 100 million Russians sitting down every night watching Первый канал, the first channel, getting their state-run, state-controlled news from their primetime news. What are they hearing? What are they learning? I watch it to know what's coming out of there. And a lot of it is absolutely ludicrous. A lot of it either completely ignores, I mean, ignores anything that's going on the other side of the battlefield, any of the setbacks on the battlefield, which is why these recent counteroffensives by Ukraine, it's quite a story that the Russians are actually now forced to acknowledge all of this. And even on state TV, they're forced to ask questions about what's going on the battlefield. Even the virulent, toxic, industrial strength propaganda of Russian state TV cannot ignore it anymore. That said, I have found that the institutes that study war and battlefield formations, and some are government agencies as well, like the British Intelligence Agency, which puts out a daily report on what's going on the battlefield, Russian-wise. It's a nonpartisan report on what's going on behind the lines. What do they think? How is Putin on the back foot? What's going on within the Kremlin? It's a pretty good, as real-time as you can get, intelligence assessment. You have things called the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, a US-based think tank, which does great work showing you real-time battlefield analysis and situation, the latest strikes on both sides, showing you really the lay of the land in terms of rockets and missiles being struck. How is the front line shifting? Where are the newest holes in the front line? Who's pushing back whom? Who's making advances? What's interesting, even if you read those types of reports, you don't just hear one narrative. You don't just hear that the Ukrainians in recent weeks and months have been making a lot of advances along the northeast front around Kharkiv, and even more incrementally along the southern front in the Kherson area. You're also hearing that the Russians, they have a mighty military machine. Yes, they may be having trouble getting troops and they may be having trouble getting ammunition, but they can still throw a lot of munitions on the battlefield and bring a lot of heavy machinery to war. You're still hearing they're still making advances in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, in that region. It might not be anything near as spectacular as we've seen on the Ukrainian side, but at least we're getting that information. We know it's happening. It's not being ignored. Whereas the Russians, they, up until very recently, they knew almost nothing about the real state of play with the Ukrainian forces. It really was as cliched as it sounded in Putin's, addresses. Basically, Russia was waging war against Ukrainian Nazis out to basically attack and endanger Russia's very existence and its national security. And only recently has that narrative shifted a tiny bit in Russia. So for me, getting fake news, I try to go as much as I can to primary sources. I try to use sources across a wide range of places. Try to use sources from the places that are actually experiencing the conflicts themselves. I try to read Russian papers. I look a lot at papers like Kommersant. Before it was pulled off the air, I used to listen to Echo Moskvy, Echo of Moscow. Great station, which was unbelievably allowed to remain on the air for quite a long time. They've been trying to get back on. And I read things like Meduza, which, the Russians think it's a biased enemy of the people. It's called a foreign agent. They have to label themselves as an iностранный agent, a foreign agent in Russian. It's ridiculous. They are a bunch of very good journalists who used to be based in Moscow and have had to relocate to Riga, Latvia, and now do online editions, very good in Russian and in English, and they have very good, reliable information. BBC Russian service, even our France24, our sister radio station, Radio France International, they have a very solid Russian language service. I read a lot of their reports, and these are reporters who aren't just sitting isolated, holed up in their little journalistic cubicles in a suburb of Paris, writing their reports. They're going to the terrain and they're seeing it. We recently had a journalist come back who was based, a Franco-Russian who was based in Russia for 10 years and finally came back to Paris because of circumstances there. But these are people who know what's going on. They've been, very, very well trained. They've been following the situation. They're not looking at it through rose-colored glasses. And I just think you have to be very careful of your sources. You have to use a diversity of sources and know what you're looking at. And it doesn't mean I love reading propaganda sources. I love reading the disinformation, but I do it knowing exactly what these sources are about, where they're coming from, and that's also very interesting in my commentaries. I love doing commentaries on, if you're a Russian right now, you're turning on your primetime news, it's 8 p.m., you're having dinner. What are you hearing tonight? What are you learning about? What do you know about the war tonight? These are fascinating stories.
How's this thing going to end? I mean, it's a hypothetical. It's not even, well, it's a hypothetical question, and it's guesswork, I guess. And again, recording this on October 11, 2022.
Yeah.
So what is there any take from your side, putting you in your professional role at this moment?
No. You know what, Chris, this is the thing, I call myself, a specialist in Russia. All bets are off when it comes to this war. I mean, I could pretend to be all erudite and to make some prediction about it. Look, I'm a foreign affairs commentator who was wrong about Donald Trump getting elected, who was wrong about Brexit. As I tell my viewers often, I've sort of given up in the prediction business. What I can do, and I'm not embarrassed to say that, I don't think it makes me an idiot. I can still call myself a specialist on Russia and say, I honestly do not know how this is going to play out because there are so many variables out there right now. The extremes, unlikely scenario. Putin falls tomorrow. There's some internal revolt within his inner circle. And all of a sudden you have some new leadership. However, that new leadership is not going to be more enlightened. The immediate people around him, the head of his National Security Service, the head of the KGB, Alexander Bortnikov, these are not enlightened people. These are people, if anything, are even almost more toxic in their ideology than Putin himself. So even if Putin were to fall, that's not in some people's cases, that's an ideal scenario. It really isn't. We might end up very much in the same or even more difficult place. The other scenario, this just drags on and on. The winter comes, everything's frozen conflict. Russia's a world champion at frozen conflicts. There's any number of them out there. Gas and energy prices go up. Europe loses its patience for all the fine words about the solidarity and standing by Ukraine. The populism rises. More populist politicians start to get elected here in Europe. The public starts to get more focused, navel gazing on their problems back home. Ukraine begins to see more and more like yesterday's story. They're not hearing it every day in their headlines. So whatever, is happening on the battlefield seems more and more distant. Some politicians will keep up the fine words, but in actual acts, it won't make much of a difference. I don't actually think that's likely either. I think there really is a new shift here and a new sense of real determination that it's even Emmanuel Macron is saying he's recognizing this is going to be more protracted and drawn out. The way he said with COVID, we're living with the virus. I think he almost sees us as living with this war against Ukraine for quite some time. So I think there's a recognition of both of these scenarios of a long, grinding war, which could be very depressing for all of us and just force a lot of changes in the way we do things. And then there's a whole number of in-between scenarios. And I don't mean to sit on the fence, but I do think that sitting on the fence is really the responsible option here, because I don't know how it's. I used to think that, if I were a betting man, your smart money would be on never giving Russia the benefit of the doubt. That is, if you have your doubt, if you're trying to make a call in one of these conflicts, just don't give Russia the benefit of the doubt. But look, something even in Russia, very unpredictable could happen. Remember in the winter of 2011 to 2012, the mass street protests during the parliamentary elections, tens of thousands coming out on the street. That was unprecedented. What was going to happen? Even the putsch in Russia, which I was there for in August 1991, the 3-day putsch where Gorbachev seemed to be under house arrest and out of power for a while. There was this emergency committee of 7 gray-suited men who seemed to have taken charge of Russia. Then it collapsed. Things can happen as quickly as they don't happen in Russia, which is why that's why I want to sit on the fence a little bit. I do think Putin, no matter what the Kremlin spin is going to be, he is on the back foot. He is right now in a weakened position. No matter how much he wants to spin it, no matter how hard his rhetoric is going to be, no matter how much he lashes out in fury with barrages of missile strikes in days to come, his actual battlefield and military situation is not that favorable. And I actually think if you had seen him in his recent speech before the farcical annexations, the illegal referendums, and then those farcical annexations, you saw the people sitting in that room in the Grand Kremlin, in the Catherine Hall of the Grand Kremlin Palace. Yeah, they were all clapping on cue for him, like as in a North Korean sort of, parliamentary assembly. But behind them, you could also see that they were clapping because it's hammered into them, drilled into them. That's what you do in Russia. You do not defy Putin. You do not show any dissent or opposition. You do not let it flicker across your face. This was a captive crowd by command. They had a captive performance. They had to do it. But I think a lot of those people, if push came to shove and Putin were to all of a sudden be really weakened and were to fall, they would embrace that. I'll just leave you with this one thought, because there was a famous story with the old former spy chief under Stalin of the Soviet Union, Lavrentiy Beria. And Beria was perhaps the most feared person ever in the history of the Soviet Union. He knew everyone's secrets, including Stalin's. He was untoppable until one day in a Presidium meeting where Khrushchev was giving a speech. Khrushchev, they saw that he was weak. They had planned this ambush in advance. Khrushchev historically reportedly pushed some button, which signaled that the guards, the army and the military guards would all come charging into the hall, arrest Beria. Before he even had a chance to realize what was happening, he was shackled, he was taken away, he was executed shortly thereafter. But the only way of doing it was literally that, was an ambush, taken by surprise, because you couldn't do it alone. It had to be sort of everyone on board, everyone pouncing at once. But the whole attitude in that room, when they saw him being arrested, everyone was delighted. It was like this giant burden had been taken off their shoulders. And I sense that there would be a similar type reaction. Sure, there'd be some genuinely disappointed people who are genuinely wedded to the Putin agenda, who really like it, who might feel shattered if Putin were to go. But I think the vast majority would very quickly get used to a new Russia.
Okay, cool. All right. Thank you, Douglas. As I prompted you before, can you give us, from your experience, professional or personal, 3 tips to become more culturally competent?
Yeah, some of these a couple of these might seem a few little cliched, but they've worked for me. I think travel. Travel is, I know that easier said than done, but yeah. I don't just mean travel, buy your ticket and take a cruise somewhere. I mean, travel with your eyes and ears open. Do not go traveling looking to find what you're looking for. Go there literally with an open mind. Travel to a place that maybe you don't quite know what to expect, and be ready to change your opinion. And when you travel, speak to people in these places. A lot of people travel and they say, "Oh, I'm traveling," and they think that just using the word and throwing it out there, travel, is a good thing. Because you're traveling, okay, I'm doing it. Whatever, I'm doing that thing everyone says you're supposed to do to open your mind. No. It's travel with a capital T. It means really being there, receptive to the cultural stimuli around you, and being open to things, open to the point of changing your own views. A lot of people come back from travel completely unchanged. I also think, and here's number 2 cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, Chris, because it's really true. Yeah. Culturally, reading a lot. I really find that reading, a lot of people I find often just read in their specialty areas. So, you're a Russia specialist, so you read every new nonfiction book that comes out and is published about Putin and Russia. I actually don't read as much as I should nonfiction-wise about Russia, perhaps. I find that the most satisfying type of, from a cultural journalistic standpoint, is to have a depth of different reading experiences. So I always try to make sure, if you do speak several languages, I like to be reading something in French. I like to be reading something in English. I often read them at the same time and go back and forth. It makes your mind shift tracks a little bit on very different subjects. Yeah, sure. I love reading books about, say, old New York, time travel in old New York. Those are my sort of I like that type of reading. But I could at the same time be reading, a book about the occupation, in real time, written by someone who died during the Nazi occupation of France, Irène Nemirovsky, Suite Française, books like that. So have not just reading, but a diversity, a depth of different reading. If you can, different languages, great. Different authors, different genders, different cultural perspectives. Don't just read within your niche. Get out of that niche as well. And I think the other tip I would give people has to do with routine, cultural routines. And I think this is where things get a little harder. because look, routine is comfortable. We all get into routines. Sometimes routines, our daily routine is imposed on us in a way because we work long hours, we get home, we're tired, you sink into the same habits. I would say sometimes totally mix things up. Do things that, spontaneously that you might not think of doing. Go to see a museum. If you live in a city where you're fortunate to have exposure to a lot of museums, go to an exhibit you might not normally see. If you don't really necessarily, if you're not into photography or something, go to a good photography exhibit. You don't like avant-garde art, maybe go see an avant-garde art museum exhibit somewhere. You see something that maybe even rubs against your grain a little bit. Break up your routine. You always go to the same cafe and you sit there and you have your same cafe creme in the morning, and you're there with your laptop, and you could be anywhere. You could be sitting in New York or London or Paris or Moscow or Shanghai, having the exact same morning routine. And yeah, you're living in different places, but are you really? Because you're in your routine bubble. Do something that breaks you out of the routine, where you sort of remind yourself of where you are, the place you're living in, and to take advantage of something that breaks you out of what's your creature comforts, what's just easy and comfortable to you. Do something that goes against the grain, break your routine, have a new experience in. Spontaneously go into a meetup group if you have a little bit of free time. Join an improvisation acting class. Join a sketching class. I did this a few years ago. I joined a sketching class. No, I don't sketch, but I joined it. And then I ended up going on a few international sketching symposium forums. I went to one in Portugal. I went to one in Chicago. Fascinating. You meet people all over the world. They're not journalists, they're sketchers, but you break your routine. You find, wow, this is interesting. I have a new interest. I didn't know I had this interest, and you never would have discovered it. Push your comfort level, push the envelope a little, break out of what is comfortable for you.
I'm gonna let my partner listen to this one, because we always tend to go to the same cafe. It's either the red place or the yellow place or the blue place. That's how I identify them.
Go to the green place.
Yeah, we'll find that. I've recently introduced here on the street that there's a Cafe Emile, which we are not frequenting, but at least let's do this. Let's take a left, not always the right. So I agree with that. Douglas, if people want to get in touch with you, how can they do that?
There are several ways they could do it. They could do it, first of all, on my work email. It is D as in Douglas, just that letter D, Herbert, no space, Herbert, at France24.com. So that's my professional address. They could also do it. They could follow me on Twitter. I am at Doug, not Douglas, just Doug, DOUG F24. So no space, just one word, DOUG F24. I am also on, although I don't use it as much, I have a professional Instagram account, and I will give away my personal Instagram account here, which I usually don't do, but I will give it to your viewers here. It's an account where I often don't share work-related experiences. I use it more to share what I was just talking about, sort of cultural and out-of-work experiences, extracurricular Douglas experiences, but I don't widely share it. I'll share it now, so I'm breaking it.
Go ahead.
So it is Herodotus, which is based on the ancient, historian and explorer, Herodotus. Is it 34? I believe it's Herodotus 34. If I got that wrong, then all of your
I'll look it up. I'll find you there, and it'll be in the show notes eventually.
I don't look at my own, but it's Herodotus. I believe it's 34. I haven't typed it myself in a long time. But that's Instagram. The show notes. And always also, but a work email. I will also give one more email, which is my personal email, Douglas, full name, .Herbert, Herbert, at gmail.com.
Yeah, first name, last name at gmail.com with a dot in between. All right, well, thank you so much. It's been one of the longest interviews I've ever done on my podcast. That is, but that's all right, because as long as it's interesting and honestly, as long as I like it, I'm okay with it.
Thank you, Chris.
All right.
It was a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm pretty sure we'll bump into each other in the future.
Not at the same cafe.
Thanks. At the same cafe. Okay, ciao.